All seeing eye. Yeah. It's really funny what the realness bring, cause everybody wanna kill the king. A couple snakes in the grass, I see them and they be slithering. To kill a mockingbird, will it sing? Yeah. And motherfucker, you could kiss the ring, and I get bread when I spill the beans. 2 birds, 1 stone, I know it can be bewildering. To kill a mockingbird, will it sing?
There was an incredible actor that helped define the term cool for what was known as the silent generation. Oftentimes forgotten because they were the generation between the quote-unquote greatest generation and the baby boomer generation. 2 of the most famous ones to ever exist, of course. However, don't let history fool you on passing up on this generation, because they gave birth to some of the most talented people to ever live. According to IMDb, the biggest male movie stars of the 1950s included names such as James Stewart, Gregory Peck, Marlon Brando, and Charlton Heston, to name a few. However, James Dean, the young Indiana-based actor, rose to superstardom amongst such legendary names and truly left an imprint on the world, even though he had only 3 major film roles before his tragic, untimely death at the age of 24 in 1955. Those 3 major film roles were in East of Eden and Rebel Without a Cause in 1955 and Giant in 1956. He is still to this day the only actor to have ever received 2 posthumous Academy Award nominations, one for Best Actor in East of Eden and the other one for Best Actor in Giant. The movie that is quite quintessential to James Dean is Rebel Without a Cause, in which portrays counterculture views of masculinity and gives birthplace to the postmodern male teenager on the big screen. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause plays the role of Jim Stark, a new transfer high school student with a troubled past seemingly only brought on by himself. He is shown throughout the film to have a very complex mental state opposed to the stoic norm that men were expected to have at that time. This brings us right into the topic of discussion, the portrayal of the postmodern teenage masculinity, which we will define as a male from the age of 13 to 19 who is filled with angst, existentialism, the need to prove themselves to parents, peers, and especially girls, all while striving to be the man in traditional 1950s sense. That long sentence can be shortened to essentially watching a teenager come of age, so to speak, and this is done very well in this building romance of a film. I can narrow the portrayal of masculinity in the film to 3 types. We will discuss each one and its effect on the postmodern teenage male psyche, while still maintaining the focus on the topic at hand. The first type of masculinity we will discuss in the film is the classic 1950s expectation of men. There is a great article on theartifice.com written by an American Studies and History student, and she gives excellent insight into America's view of how men on and off the television should be at the time. During the 1950s, television gender roles were stricter and more rigid than they had ever been. The men put on their business suits every morning, went to their conforming jobs, become part of the American rat race, and then were expected to come home and be a father figure and a husband. These were oftentimes the same men that had fought on the battlefields of World War II or the Korean War, and now their duties had changed, so that they had to fight communism at home by being the perfect American man. She cites the author Sloan Wilson, author of The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which was published in 1955, the same year that Rebel Without a Cause came out. The biggest takeaway from Wilson would be this quote: "Now it is time to raise legitimate children and make money and dress properly and be kind to one's wife and admire one's boss and learn not to worry and think of oneself as what? That makes no difference," he thought. "I'm just a man in a gray flannel suit." End quote. Now, with that being said, teenagers during the 1950s were expected to follow suit and being a true American man, where anything considered feminine at the time must not be done by a man. Women and children had their role as subordinate to the stoic, rational day-working man. In the film, the two characters that fit this role are Detective Ray Fremick, we were introduced to in the beginning sequence, and Judy's father. Detective Fremick is the first shown as someone who is both mentally and physically tough, as he does not submit to Jim's drunken antics.
Big, tough character. You don't kid me, pal.
This showed the true essence of male 1950s bravado, mental stability, and being able to defend themselves, opposed to Jim's teenage mental instability, or hang-ups so to speak, over his parents, and his clear lack of strength to overcome Detective Fremick. The other person in the narrative that exemplifies the 1950s male is Judy's father. We don't see much of her father, but we are first introduced to him as the working man who comes home after work in a suit to his wife and or helper having dinner made for him and the family. Just as a setup, there is an indication that there may have been some type of special attraction that Judy's father had for her in the past, but she is 16 and too old now. With that being said, Judy's father slaps her when she is trying to get a kiss from him again, showing the overarching theme of the 1950s men, stoicism and power, albeit physical or status-wise. The wife sitting there and accepting the fact that he can do as he pleases also shows the subordinate role of women at the time. Throughout the rest of the film, when we see him, he is shown to have the most power in the family and also tells Jim to leave him alone, again showing the mental strength to not hear him out. This also indicates that Jim is very much a teenager still, and is not respected enough to be heard out by what the 1950s would deem a real man. Jim at this point in time is also frantic and abashed with his actions during the chicken run with Buzz earlier in the film. He truly feels like the world is crashing down on his shoulders, even more so than his early outbursts in the film of his parents tearing him apart. Jim feels stuck and is trying to prove himself to be a man by taking action, but is not taken seriously because of his age, a frustration that troubles many male teens today in the late 2010s as well. The second form of masculinity portrayed in the film is what I will call the emasculated 1950s male, the so to speak pushover, the man who doesn't wear the pants, as they would say, and oftentimes the wife is the one in power. This was not something that the 1950s film industry at the time wanted to portray because again, the ideal man is stoic and powerful. At the time, women were seen as subordinate as well, so this type of portrayal in 1950s men on the screen could jeopardize their position of power in the public's eyes.
What do you mean I don't treat you like a woman? I treat you like a woman. I let you sew, I let you cook, I let you wash the windows, I let you clean up. Boys don't do that, Alice.
That's right, Ralph. That's all a wife is to you, Ralph. Just a handy utensil to have around the house. A wife can cook and slave and clean for you all day long. You would never think of saying something pleasant to her. You wouldn't even think of doing a simple little gentlemanly thing like tipping your hat.
Now, get my stuff!
There's actually one character I'd like to focus on for this type, and that's Jim's dad, Frank Stark. Frank from the start of the film is shown to be more in a servile role than a power position. He almost sounds like he's whining about how he tries to reach his son and buys him everything he wants.
But you can't protect me.
Do you mind if I try? Do you have to slam the door in my face? I try to get to him. What happens? Don't I buy you everything you want? A bicycle? You get a bicycle. A car?
You buy me many things.
No. Well, not just buying.
The wife is also questioning his statements, thus publicly challenging his views. The ideal wife at the time would not question the husband, but rather go along with him. Also, Frank's mother, Jim's grandmother, would always step in to defend her son, which also even more emasculates Frank, because it takes his own mother to stick up for him. The second example that shows Frank's emasculated masculinity is the scene where Jim comes back home to find out his father is not only wearing a feminine apron, but also cooked a meal for the mother, which of course was the woman's job at the time for the most part. On top of all of that, he is both visibly and verbally worried and frantic about Jim's mother finding out he dropped the meal on the floor and is trying to clean up the mess so he presumably does not get scolded by her. This is a clear indicator that Frank is the subordinate in the relationship, and especially when his mother isn't around to stand up for him. How this even more relates to Jim's teenage masculinity is that he feels this is not only emasculating but very humiliating because Jim is striving to become the ideal 1950s man while also dealing with teenage angst and hang-ups. Jim even stated earlier to Detective Fremick, the ideal 1950s man, how if his own father just struck the mother once to establish his dominance as a man, the whole power dynamic would switch.
She eats him alive and he takes it.
Things pretty rough for you at home?
At the zoo.
What?
At the zoo. I mean, he always wants to be my pal, you know? But how can I give him anything if he's... Well, I mean, I love him and all that type of stuff, and I mean, I don't want to hurt him, but then I don't know what to do anymore except maybe die. I mean, if he had guts to knock Mom cold once, then maybe she'd be happy and then she'd stop picking on him. Because they make mush out of him. You know, just mush. No, I'll tell you one thing, I don't ever want to be like him.
Chicken?
But still feeling quite powerless and lost himself. This again shows the nature of postmodern male teenagers, striving to be whatever era's ideal man, but still having the feeling of constant uncertainty and hints of existentialism. He goes on to finish the scene upset because he feels his father shouldn't have to be worried about what his mother thinks because he is the man of the house. Now to focus on the main masculinity shown, Jim Starks.
What are you, crud chicken? Don't call me that!
I would even argue this movie was the birthplace of the portrayal of postmodern teenage males in cinema, or at least in the 1950s Technicolor era of cinema. Jim is the star of the film, so naturally there are plenty of examples of his teenage masculinity. I would say the first example that shows this well is Jim's unwillingness to back down to a challenge, especially when he's being called a coward or chicken. More specifically during the observatory encounter with Buzz Gunderson, when Buzz and his goons start mocking Jim for being a chicken to not doing anything about them flattening one of his tires.
Is that meaning me? Is that meaning me? What? Chicken! Yes. You shouldn't call me that. I'll tell you one thing, I don't ever want to be like him.
Chicken?
I bet you see right through me, don't you?
What the sequence shows is that teenagers always feel the need for not only social validation, typically,
Taurus, the bull, an extremely ancient constellation.
but also making themselves feel important, or at the very least, not being looked down upon by peers. Jim was not about to let Buzz emasculate him in front of everyone, especially his love interest Judy, like his mother had probably been emasculating his father all his life. Most rational 1950s men would have either intimidated Buzz enough to back off, or would have simply walked away because there was no good reason to retaliate. Jim comes out on top during the little sticking game that Buzz played with him, which again not only helps him feel more strong as a young man, but also gives him more status amongst peers, including Judy. One could argue a lot of the issues that befall postmodern male teenagers has to do with their hormones starting to change and them wanting to start to have sex for the first era in their lives, so being seen as desirable in young women's eyes is important. To be more succinct, teenage men want to impress girls in order to have sex, and will do almost whatever it takes in order to do so. This is especially shown when Jim puts his life on the line again during the chicken run scene. Buzz actually dies. He dies. I would argue that this was because of his yearning to prove himself to his peers, even though his jacket got caught on the door handle. I believe that if he had nothing to prove, he would have not gotten in that car in the first place. The chicken run, I would argue, only happened because Buzz had to maintain his dominance after losing some reputation by losing the sticking battle to Jim. Moving right along into the second example of teenage masculinity is the constant struggle with Jim's need to prove himself, in this case to his parents, because teens feel like they aren't being taken seriously most of the time as a young man. Jim, after admitting to being a part of the chicken run that ultimately led to Buzz's demise, wants to turn himself into the police, or at least talk to Detective Fremick. His parents, however, urge him not to, and give him the typical response that teenagers despise. You'll understand when you're older. Frank, his father, is urged by Jim towards the end of the argument to just stick up for him, or at the very least, himself.
Mom, I want to do something right. And I don't want you to run away from me again. Dad?
This is all going too fast for me,
You better give
son.
me something. You better give me something fast.
Jimmy, you're very young. A foolish decision now could wreck your whole life. In 10 years, you'll never know this even happened.
Dad, answer her. Tell her. 10 years. Dad, let me hear you answer her. Dad. Dad, stand up for me.
And when he fails to do so, Jim even lays his hands on his own father out of frustration.
Stand up!
You want to kill your own father?
All of this still occurs today, maybe without the physical part. Postmodern male teens always want to prove themselves and want to look up to someone, typically, if the father can't provide that role. This is at least speaking in a more 1950s sense.
All right.
You know, I bet you're a real yo-yo.
I love you too.
The last point I want to make is that Jim in the end winds up seeing the consequences of all of his actions, good or bad, and the only thing he can do is keep looking forward because life goes on. This film's plot takes place in only one day. However, it is yet another classic Bildungsroman of a story of a postmodern teenager struggling to find his sense of masculinity in the world. In the end, in a lot of ways, Jim only did what he did throughout the film out of teenage angst.
You're tearing me apart!
What?
You say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again!
Or the need to prove himself for no real reason. Jim Stark was the rebel without a cause. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching this film analysis on Rebel Without a Cause. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and favorite it if you enjoyed it that much. And also, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you, everybody. This is Sid signing off. I hope you have a good night.
I was up grinding every night and day. They were sleeping on us, but we're going fast now. And you saw how all of them was MIA. Now they're waking up, they see us swaying in the background. Shit never be the same. Wake up and I freeze the frame. I gotta get my kids.